Welcome to Knife Chats. If you like what you see, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it with friends, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thank you.
Thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about a knife pattern that is probably one of my all-time favorite knife patterns, even though I never seem to list it as one of my top fives, and that is the Swell Center Hunter. Specifically the hunter pattern of this swell center knife. There are other knives out there that are also swell centers. Most of them are small jackknives and whittlers and a few other things. But what I'm talking specifically about is the Swell Center Hunter, which is a large frame, normally single bladed knife. And what you see here is my full collection of Swell Center Hunters. Just 4 knives so far. And I probably will not get too many more simply because I really want to get the authentic USA made ones, and they are just more or less scarce and hard to come by, and when you can find one, they tend to be expensive. So that's something to keep in mind if you're ever thinking of collecting Swell Center Hunters. Now, if you follow my channel, you've probably seen this before already. The Great Eastern Cutlery Coke bottle knife. This one's a little small for a Swell Center Hunter, coming in at 4 3/4 inches long. But it's still, in my book, a Swell Center Hunter. The typical Swell Center Hunter would have been 5 1/4 to 5.5 inches long. Some of them were longer than that. Some of them were shorter, but this is close enough to be a Swell Center Hunter in my book. Now, if you notice, you have this frame that has a bump on the backside and a bump on the top. Now, there's a reason why the frame is designed the way it is, and that is because of the large blade that is inside here. If you notice, you have a relatively wide clip blade on the inside of a somewhat slender frame. And the way they've done that is by swelling the frame in the center here. You notice nice narrow neck here, swells out, and then it drops down a little bit, and then it swells at the very bottom of the knife. So let me show you by comparison. Here we have a Master Barlow, or sometimes known as a Granddaddy Barlow, Daddy Barlow, whatever. And you notice it has a straight frame, even though it is narrower at the top than at the bottom. And if you look at that with the Swell Center Hunter, you can see the difference in the shapes of the handle. But because this handle is just nice and straight, you'll see the blade on there is a much narrower blade than what you have in a Swell Center Hunter. Notice the thickness of the blades. One of them is, much narrower, and it just doesn't have the belly that you have in a Swell Center Hunter. Now, the reason that happens is you see the bump here in the back spring. You need a relatively heavy back spring in order to keep this large blade in place. And because of that, you're going to have a nice thick spring here. And the spring would be going into the handle. And where you see the pin passing through the spring, well, when you do it on the Barlow, you can't see it in there, but basically the spring will swell on the inside, so that because where the pin passes through, that is the weakest point in the spring, so you have to make the spring wider at that point in order so that the pin passing through there will not cause the spring to break easily. So what you have in the Swell Center Hunter is they've taken the back spring and they've reversed it so that instead of the bump being hidden inside the handle, it is bumping on the outside, causing the swell there. And then the swell on the top end, while possibly is not that necessary, it does help create a large enough handle so that you can get a better purchase on it. So it feels better in your hand with the bump there. It gives you a nice place to kind of index the knife when you have it in your hand. Plus, when you close the knife, it comes up to meet the swell of the blade. So it's really not making too much more room in your hand. And that's the reason why the shape of the handle is the way it is. It allows you to get a nice strong backspring, a very thick backspring, as you can tell there, into the knife handle, and still have a strong spring pinned in place, because the swell is now on the outside of the handle instead of on the inside of the handle. That was the design feature of the Swell Center Hunter that made it a very popular knife. Very strong backspring, very wide blade, a very usable blade. So that's why this knife became so popular when it first came out. As I mentioned, the knives are commonly referred to as Coke bottle knives these days, which is really interesting because the pattern itself dates from around 1830 or 1840, and they were extremely popular around the time of the Civil War and into the 1880s, 1890s. And they actually started to wane in popularity with people looking at other styles of folding hunters starting around the turn of the century, around 1900 to 1920. Other patterns of folding hunters started becoming more popular. And by 1930, 1940, these knives were not even being made anymore, with the exception of one particular frame. So why are these knives known as Coke bottle knives, considering the Coke bottle that they're named after did not even come into existence until 1915? And my theory is that knife companies hooked on to the popularity of Coca-Cola and decided to pass off an old frame as a new frame by now calling the knives Coke bottle knives. And it may have worked. It might have helped sales for a little bit, especially in 1920, 1930. But by World War II, these knives were dead. No one was really interested in Coke bottle hunters anymore. So they get labeled a Coke bottle knife somewhere around 1915 and 1925, but the knives have already been around for almost a century already, and it's hard to imagine that they were just being called Swell Center Hunter all that time. And to be honest, typically what they were just called is a folding hunter, but they did have other nicknames for the pattern. Now, one of the most common nicknames given to these knives is right here on this Great Eastern Cutlery knife, and that is Beaver Tail. Now, the reason they gave it the name Beaver Tail is because of the shape of the handle here. Notice it's a flat handle, and it has that little bit of a drop here, and then it swells out, and it ends in a nice rounded portion, very similar to what you see in a beaver's tail. So the knives were commonly referred to as a beaver tail knife. And this is especially true when the knife lacks an end cap. If it doesn't have an end cap, you see it even more. So these would be called a beaver tail knife. The other nickname that they were given is right here when you're looking at it. It was also referred to as a fiddleback, because you've got the long neck of the violin, and then you've got the way it bends down in here, and then it swells at the bottom, similar to what you see in a fiddle or a violin. So they were also known as a fiddleback knife. Those were the two most common nicknames given to the Swell Center knives, beaver tail and fiddleback. Now this one here by Case, I actually picked it up recently. It's actually from 1988. And this one's kind of interesting in that instead of having a large clip blade, it has a spear master blade. And these were relatively common, but not nearly as common as the ones with the large clip blade. Now the ones with the clip blade were normally referred to as a hunter, but the ones with a spear blade such as this, They were most often referred to as a stabber because the blade is designed more for poking than it is for heavy cutting and everything. You can imagine trying to cut with this heavy material and stuff. You could easily break the blade because of how thin it is. But they were relatively common, and they were also quite popular, especially if they had a lock on the back. Because if the blade locked, then it would be much easier for stabbing and not worrying about the blade closing up on them. But that is a derivative of the fiddlebacks and the beaver tail knives, the beaver tail stabbers, as opposed to a beaver tail hunter. And as long as we were just looking at that beaver tail stabber, we have here your folding dirk knives, which you can see a very close family resemblance to the to a Swell Center stabber. And the difference being is you have a heavier pommel on these, but these were contemporaries of each other, and neither of the knives are still really around anymore today. So these started waning in popularity around 1870, 1880 or so. And the difference between them is really just the heavy pommel, and almost always with a lock on the back, versus the Swell Center stabbers that probably started losing popularity around 1880 or so also, but they still remained in production for some time afterwards, using the Swell Center frame instead of the bottom swell frame on a folding dirk. Let's move on to one of the frames that lasted the longest in the Coke bottle lineup. Now, I don't have an original one of these. This was a frame that was very popular with Case, and they stopped using the frame around 1970 or so. They just it just wasn't selling. But this is one of the few Coke bottle frames that lasted beyond World War II. Most of the frames stopped being used around 1940 or so, but this particular frame by Case lingered on until 1970 and remains somewhat popular. And the difference between the typical Coke bottle and this frame is obvious. It's got a like a copperhead swell top bolster. And this is actually very much a copy of what you saw in the Case lineup. And what you had in it is a large clip blade, often with a saber grind, and the copperhead bolster going on there. And the copperhead bolster acts a little bit as a guard, so your hand doesn't slip up on there. But otherwise, you see a Coke bottle frame there. The top bump is not nearly as pronounced as the bottom bump is. This is my least favorite of the Coke bottle frames, but I have to admit it is probably the most practical of the Coke bottle frames. I just don't like the way it looks, though. You still have a relatively thick blade going on with it, and because of that bump there, you don't have that annoying notch that would catch in your pocket and such. And yes, these knives back in the 1800s and stuff, they were definitely something that was carried in the pocket. They were not sheath carried or anything like that. They'd just be tossed in a pocket. Obviously, in workmen's pockets and stuff, it wouldn't have been nearly as much of a problem. I'll talk about this one in a minute too. But this definitely was one that managed to last a little longer. But you also see that it is the Coke bottle frame has evolved a little bit in this knife. It has become a little bit more modern. So now, if you don't know, this one was made in 2019, and this one dates from 1988. It was made by Case, but the frame was a special factory offering. It's not something that will normally show up in a Case lineup, especially with a Spear Master blade. But the only Coke bottle knife I have from pre-World War II time is this one here by Colonial, and is actually a two-blade Coke bottle knife, which is somewhat uncommon. Typically, the Coke bottle hunters only have one blade. If they have a second blade, the typical second blade that you would find on them would be a straight or skinning blade, or a spear blade, such as what you saw on this Coke bottle, or a saw. But this particular one was designed with the fisherman in mind, and actually has a scaling blade here, with a bottle opener, which lets you know that it is kind of a later model version of a Coke bottle. Not to mention the celluloid handles going on with it. And this one dates probably from sometime in the 1930s or 40s. It was made by Colonial. You see the very large clip blade going on with it. And the beaver tail end here, so no end cap and everything. But that is the only older version of a Coke bottle that I have. As I mentioned, this was the knife for the outdoorsman from about 1840 to about 1890. This was the knife that you would have found in the pockets of trappers, hunters, military men, so on and so forth. In fact, it is said that the Swell Center Hunter was the knife that was the favorite knife of George Armstrong Custer. This is the knife that was found on him. He actually had a particular knife company that made his Swell Center Hunters for him, because that was the knife he liked and that was the knife company he liked. Very popular knives for anyone at the time. And it remained that way for a good 50 or 60 years before it started falling out of favor. And the reason it started falling out of favor is because people found a way to make a better folding hunter. And this frame, while it was very practical at the time, did have its faults. And so you started seeing a new style of folding hunter come along, and you can see that it is much more modern looking than what you see on the Swell Center Hunters. And here we have what's commonly referred to as a folding hunter today. It's also known as the American Clasp knife. And you notice now the bump on the back is gone, but you still have the bump on the front side. And now you have a powder horn end at the bottom here. This was done partly for saving space in the pocket, making it easier to get in and out of the pocket and everything else. Plus, because you have that little bump there, you can actually bash something, like hit a fish on the head with it and use it as a fish priest and stuff like that. So you can actually stun an animal or a bird with it and kill it that way. Also, you now have a built-in sort of like a copperhead top going on, and you still have the large clip blade in place. This is obviously a modern version of these also, but you still have the swell on the inside portion of the handle here, which allows you to get a good purchase on the knife and also a good place to index your hand. So that's the portion of the handle that is swollen still, but otherwise it's fairly straight on the back side. So you still have a relatively slender handle for a very wide blade. So that's what happened with the Swell Center Hunter. It just kind of got turned inside out and turned into a powder horn. And I mentioned earlier that you have Swell Center Hunters that have two blades, and this particular folding hunter has the blades that I was talking about. So now, before I showed you this one here with the fish scaling blade in the front side, all I can say is kind of imagine that knife, but instead of having the fish scaling blade, you would have had a straight blade up in the front side here. It's called a straight blade by a lot of people today, but back in the day, this was known as the skinning blade, S-K-I-N-N-I-N-G. Imagine that in the front. That would have been the typical blade you would have found in the old fiddleback knives, a skinning blade and a clip blade. And all they've done is change the frame out to the newer style folding hunter frame. versus the Coke bottle frame. So the blades lived on in the newer folding Hunter frames, but the frame basically changed to become a little more ergonomic and a little more user friendly. Now, if you're thinking of collecting the original Coke bottle knives, the ones from before the 1940s, going back into the 1800s and stuff, expect to pay quite a bit of money for them. Even the ones in just good used condition or even poor condition are going to run you a pretty penny. Matter of fact, even the reproduction ones that were made after World War II, such as this one from 1988 by Case, these are not that cheap either. You're going to pay fairly decent money for them. This probably cost about $50 or $60 when it came out in 1988. And you're going to be paying 70, 80, maybe up to $100 for it, maybe even more than $100. And the only way you're going to do it is through open bidding if you can find them, because they're just not made anymore. Now this Great Eastern Cutlery one, they made this in a couple different handle materials. They were all running around $100 when they first came out. Now that they're out of production and becoming harder to find, the price is jumping up right away. It's probably already up into the $150 to $175 on the secondary market, and will only go up in price. And surprisingly, the same thing is even happening to Rough Rider Coke bottle knives. This particular one is still in stock. You can get it for around $10, but the ones that are out of stock are already going in the range of $25, $30, sometimes as much as $40, and that is in open bidding. That's how much people are getting for it. It isn't how much people are asking for it. They're actually getting that kind of money on these Chinese-made Coke bottle knives. And this is actually a frame that I'm not even crazy about, but it is still one of those knives that sells quite well. And it's just nobody is really making them. So if you're thinking of collecting them, just be prepared that they are not going to be an inexpensive hobby. But at the same time, they are definitely part of early Americana. And especially if you're interested in like the Old West, the Civil War, the Indian Wars, that time period and such, this is the knife you would have found on the cowboys. Let's put it that way. So the Coke bottle knives are kind of a really cool pattern. You just don't see them that often anymore.
Thank you for visiting Knife Chats. I hope you enjoyed your time here. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel and ringing that notification bell so that you will be notified when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. See you soon.